Somewhere in the highlands of southern Africa, hidden among granite hills and dry savanna, there is a wall. It stretches over 250 meters in length. In places it rises nearly 10 meters high. It was built without a single drop of mortar. No cement, no binding agent, just hand-cut granite blocks, shaped and stacked with such precision that the structure has stood for over 700 years. For most of the 20th century, the world's leading archaeologists looked at this wall and said, with complete confidence, that the African people living nearby could not possibly have built it. That conclusion was not based on evidence. It was based on something far more deliberate. In 1871, a German geologist and explorer named Karl Mauck arrived at the ruins. He was not the first person to know they existed. The local Shona people had never forgotten them. But he was the first European to formally document what he saw. What Mauck encountered was extraordinary. Massive stone enclosures, a towering conical structure, and walls of such architectural sophistication that he struggled to process them. His solution was not to ask the people who had lived alongside these ruins for generations. Instead, he reached back into the Bible. He declared that the site must be a replica of Solomon's temple, or perhaps the palace of the Queen of Sheba. The idea that an indigenous African civilization had designed and constructed it simply did not enter his framework as a serious possibility. That dismissal would echo for the next 100 years. The physical evidence told a completely different story. Excavations at the site uncovered Chinese porcelain from the Song and Ming dynasties, Persian glass beads, Arab coins, and iron tools. There was gold, significant quantities of it, along with evidence of sophisticated metalworking. And there were the birds. Carved from soapstone, standing roughly 30 centimeters tall, these sculptures depicted a creature that blended human and avian features with a stylistic precision unlike anything found in the surrounding region. 8 of them were eventually recovered. Today, one of these birds appears on the flag of Zimbabwe, the national currency, and the country's coat of arms. Together, these artifacts painted a portrait not of an isolated settlement, but of a thriving urban center deeply embedded in Indian Ocean trade networks, exchanging goods with Arabia, Persia, and China. At its height, around 1400 of the Common Era, the city housed an estimated 18,000 people. It was one of the largest urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa. By the time these artifacts were being cataloged, southern Africa was being carved up by European colonial powers. Cecil Rhodes, the British mining magnate whose name would be stamped across the region for decades, had a direct financial and political interest in the narrative surrounding the ruins. He funded expeditions specifically designed to prove that the site had been built by ancient Phoenicians, Arabs, or any civilization other than the local African population. In 1891, an antiquarian named James Theodore Bent led one such expedition. His conclusions, shaped more by the expectations of his funders than by the physical evidence, pointed toward foreign origins. Then, in 1902, a man named Richard Hall was appointed as the official curator of the site. Hall did not merely interpret the evidence incorrectly, he physically destroyed it. In his efforts to remove what he called the filth and decadence of the Kafir occupation, he excavated and discarded the upper archaeological layers, the very strata that contained the clearest evidence of African habitation. Decades of irreplaceable context were gone. The motivation was not academic. Admitting that an advanced African civilization had built Great Zimbabwe would have directly undermined the ideological foundation of colonial rule, which rested on the premise that African peoples were incapable of self-governance or complex civilization. In 1905, a British archaeologist named David Randall McIver arrived at the site with no predetermined conclusion. He applied rigorous stratigraphic analysis to what remained after Hall's destruction and published a finding that was, in his own words, unquestionably African in origin. The professional response was swift and punishing. Randall McIver was marginalized, his conclusions dismissed by the colonial establishment and much of the academic community that depended on its goodwill. The truth, however, was not finished. In 1929, an archaeologist named Gertrude Caton Thompson returned to Great Zimbabwe, leading one of the first all-female excavation teams in the history of the discipline. Her methods were meticulous, using careful stratigraphic analysis across multiple excavation trenches. She confirmed and expanded upon Randall McIver's findings. The construction, the occupation, the artifacts, all of it pointed to a medieval African civilization, specifically the ancestors of the Shona people. Her report was definitive. The science was settled, and yet the colonial government of Rhodesia continued to suppress the truth for another 5 decades. Official guidebooks distributed to tourists at the site were censored well into the 1970s, omitting or contradicting the established archaeological consensus. Museum staff who acknowledged African origins risked their positions. The political stakes had not changed. If anything, as independence movements gained momentum across Africa, the need to maintain the fiction became more urgent for those in power. It was not until 1980, when Zimbabwe gained independence and the new government renamed the nation after the ruins themselves, that the historical record began to be restored in any official capacity. The name Zimbabwe derives from the Shona phrase meaning houses of stone. The country chose to carry that name forward as an act of reclamation. There is one part of this story that remains genuinely unresolved, and it deserves to be stated honestly. Around 1450 of the Common Era, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. The population dispersed. The trading networks shifted. The reasons are still debated among archaeologists and historians. Some point to environmental exhaustion. The surrounding land may have been stripped of the resources needed to sustain a city of that size. Others argue that gold trade routes shifted northward, drawing economic and political power away from the site. Still others suggest internal political fragmentation, as regional power centers competed and the centralized authority that had sustained the city collapsed. No single explanation has achieved consensus. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe remains one of Southern Africa's most compelling open questions. What happened at Great Zimbabwe was not a simple misunderstanding or an honest academic debate that took time to resolve. It was a sustained, institutionally enforced erasure of a civilization's history, carried out because the truth was politically inconvenient for those who had taken the land. The ruins themselves survived. The soapstone birds, scattered and sold during the colonial period, have been partially repatriated. The science, when finally allowed to speak, was unambiguous. But the question this story leaves behind is larger than one site in one country. How many other histories have been buried, rewritten, or simply ignored because they contradicted the story those in power needed to be true? If you have a theory about why Great Zimbabwe was abandoned, environmental collapse, shifting trade, political fracture, or something else entirely, share it in the comments. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribing to Orevorax ensures you will be here for the next one.